I am indeed a Blue Badge tourist guide. Now, as Lindsay said, there's a lot of confusion about the disabled Blue Badge parking, and we're trying to raise the profile of what the tourist Blue Badge is. So it's really nice to be able to tell you a little bit about that this evening. So what is a Blue Badge tourist guide? Let's have a look. So this is a picture of the Blue Badge. I am a Blue Badge. I'm wearing a Blue Badge around my neck here. And you'll see that at the top of that image, it says Institute of Tourist Guiding. So this is the logo of the Institute of Tourist Guiding. And it is basically a national organization. It was set up in 2002. Prior to that, the badge was in the hands of the local regional tourist boards. So there were Blue Badges, but it wasn't really a national qualification. 2002, the Institute was set up to really regularize the whole thing. And they are now the body which administers the training and the exams and regulates the accreditation. And you'll see in the logo that there is a blue oval, which is the Blue Badge. And the Blue Badge is what we call people who can tour in various areas of the country. So for me, you'll see on my badge there, it says the heart of England. There are other badges elsewhere as well. There's also a green badge. You'll see that green oval in the middle, and they are for towns or cities. So for instance, there's a green badge for Oxford, for the City of London and various other places. There's also a white badge, which is shown by the little white squares at the end. And a white badge is representing a different site. So it might be a particular house or a large site, such as in London, for instance, there is a white badge for Tower Bridge. And the Institute of Tourist Guiding logo on the left, on the right. And in the centre is the area that is the heart of England. So it's really 8 counties all around Birmingham, including the West Midlands there. And that is the area in which I am qualified to guide in. So potentially I could be guiding in any of that area. I do a lot of work in Oxford because it's a bit of a hotspot. I do quite a lot of work in the Cotswolds, Warwick, Worcester, Birmingham, not so much north of Birmingham. But of course, inevitably, because I live near Stratford, I get a lot of work in Stratford. So let me tell you how I became a tourist guide. Okay, so I have done various jobs throughout my life. In 2013, I started working at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust as a guide in the house. I had many years ago, I did a degree in history, but never really used it in my any of my jobs. So this time it was great because I was able to start using that history and also my love of Shakespeare. And you'll see me there in the costume. I also love sewing, so I got very interested in the costume and also in the sort of embroidery and needlework that women would have done. The picture on the right shows a bit of a close-up of the coif with the blackwork embroidery, which I made and which I wore in the house. And I used to sit in the house and do embroidery so people could actually see it and I could talk about it as they came round. So working in Shakespeare's birthplace, I of course became aware that there were lots of tourist groups coming round and got to know some of the tour guides that came round with them and realized that there was this thing called a Blue Badge tourist guide and that it seemed like a really interesting opportunity. So there was a course running in 2015. I joined the course. It is a year's course followed by exams at the end. So written exams in your knowledge of the region and in British history and British society, really, all sorts of things. And also practical exams, so a walking tour, a coach tour, a tour of a religious building, such as a cathedral, and a tour of an art gallery or museum. So it's quite a rigorous qualification, really, and very happy to get my badge in 2016. So what do we do? Let me show you. So potentially we could do pretty much any kind of touring that you might imagine. So we work freelance. We can be hired by individuals, groups. We can have short tours, maybe just a couple of hours. It might be a group coming to, say, to Stratford, just want a walking tour of the town. You might do that for a group or just a couple. You know, it could be families, it could be absolutely anyone. We also are hired by coach companies or tour operators to accompany a group on a coach tour. Quite often I do those around Cotswolds for the day, stopping at one or two villages on the way. Sometimes I do coach tours of Stratford around the town and also out towards Anne Hathaway's cottage and up around Mary Arden's farm. Sometimes I am hired to do longer tours with groups that might be over here for several days. And in the centre, you'll see there's a picture of a choir where I was accompanying an American choir. They stayed at various different places, Stratford, Oxford, for instance. That's actually a picture which was taken in the chapel of St John's College, Cambridge. So that's great fun because you get to know the group over a few days, and it's quite a privilege to be able to spend time with them and in a special tour like that. But inevitably, as I said, most of my work is in Stratford. So there's a picture of me on the right with a little family. There's a couple of sisters who came over with their mother who was in a wheelchair, and we did a very gentle walk around the town, and they were lovely. They really appreciated seeing Shakespeare's town. So that's a little bit of background about what Blue Badge tour guides are. What do people like to see? Well, in Stratford, we are so lucky because we have this amazing array of timber framed buildings, many of which will be very familiar to you. So I think it's just amazing, really. People are always appreciative of the amount of buildings that we still have here that which have been preserved, especially the ones that are still used in the way in which they were intended to be used. So such as the guild cottages and the guild hall and schoolroom. You know, people are really impressed when I tell them that they are between 600 and 500 years old, and that there are still retired people living in the almshouses as there would have been in Shakespeare's time. And of course, the schoolroom, still used for teaching for the boys of Kes today. So I think that's an absolute wonderful little image. I love to stand people on the corner outside the restaurant opposite, so they get a fantastic view down the road there, looking at that range of buildings. It's also good to point out how you can tell the old timber buildings from the new ones. So, for instance, looking at the Shakespeare hostelry, the part to the right with those 5 gables all matching is older than the bit on the left. And so it's quite interesting to show people the differences and how you can tell, you know, things like the straightness of the timbers, the way it's constructed, to point out that not everything is as it seems. The one I really like to show people, if I have got time to take them along there, is the wonderful building in the middle, Mason's Court, and point out that it would have been a farmhouse originally, open to the timbers and smoke just coming up from that central fireplace in the middle of the room. And I love the fact that it's got the police sign next to it. I wish I could tell people that it was the police station, but sadly not. But I think it's fantastic the way it has survived, surrounded by all the other development along Rother Street there. The other thing you can do, of course, walking around, is to show details. Now, I'm sorry this is a bit of a jumble because this was intended to be an animation, but hopefully you can see a few little details. So, for instance, over on the right, you've got some details of the carving on Harvard House. There is, of course, lots of detailed foliage and flowers, as well as the initials and the bull's head by the front door of Harvard House. And you can see the picture there of what I think is a greyhound. If anybody knows any more information about that, I would love to know. I've tried to find out, but I presume it's probably something to do with the Garrick Inn, because that used to be called the Greyhound. So I'm guessing that that's what that is. But anyway, either way, it's a lovely carving. So do please tell me at the end if you have any information about that. One of my favourite buildings in the town is the Old Bank, and those fantastic terracotta tiles with all the little scenes of Shakespeare plays. If people are interested in Shakespeare plays, it's a great opportunity, if you can find the space, to stand opposite and point out some of the different scenes, particularly the one over the front door, which is that scene from Merchant of Venice, which is, somebody must have had a bit of a sense of humour in the design office to show that scene over the front door of the bank. And I like standing on the corner at the top of Sheep Street, where you're opposite the Garrick Inn and Harvard House, looking across to the bank, and also, of course, at the town hall. So you've got an array of buildings, all in different styles, which I think is really interesting and a really good point to point out the variety that we have. And also looking at the coat of arms of Shakespeare there in the picture, I always ask people what they think it is that is shown. An amazing number of people always say that the spear is a pen, and of course you have to point out that he would have used a quill and it wouldn't have looked like that, but that you explain that it is a spear, and it's a bit of a pun on his name. So there's lots of little details that is great to be able to point out. Also, you can sometimes talk about different themes as you go around, particularly if you've got a young group, so students or children. And one of the themes I like to talk about is the swans, because we have a lot of swan imagery around the town. So, of course, you've got the Swan Fountain at the bottom there, beautiful stainless steel sculpture. And I like to tell them about the sculptor, Christine Lee, who was actually the sister of Jennifer Worth, who wrote the Call the Midwife books, and who had herself trained as a nurse and then later as a sculptor. There are little swan images on the tops of a lot of the street furniture. So if you look at the top left there, you've got that lovely swan on the top of the road signs, the signposts. And there's a lot of those around the town, which I sometimes get the younger visitors to try to spot as we go around. On the district council coat of arms on the top right, you've also got those lovely swans, and notice in their beaks, they're each holding something different. So the top right is holding some oak leaves, which represents the forest of Arden, the woodland that surrounded the town to the north. And the bottom left is holding a little sheaf of wheat, representing the Feldon or the agriculture further to the south. And then, of course, you've got the river coming across the middle. The Black Swan, always a good story to talk about the Black Swan and the Dirty Duck. And there seemed to be a bit of a variety of stories about how it became known as the Dirty Duck. One story was that it was the actors at the theatre, the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in the early 1900s, who sort of adopted the pub and nicknamed it. But also I've heard a story about maybe it was the American GIs in the war that nicknamed it the Dirty Duck. So if anyone else can enlighten me about that, please do. And the top middle picture, has anybody ever noticed those beautiful swans on the guttering on the White Swan Inn at the top of bottom of Rother Street, really, the top of Mere Street, I mean, really. Absolutely beautiful pictures of swans which have a crown around their necks and chains attached to their legs, the sort of heraldic image of a swan. And those were created in the 1920s when the inn was taken over by the Trust Houses group. And if you look up above the swan in the picture, you'll see the initials TH, which represents that. So there's all these little details that are great to point out. And of course, we have the real swans. There we are. People love Stratford because it is very picturesque, especially along by the river there. They love to spend time looking at the swans. I tell them about the fact that, 40-odd years ago, there were very, very few swans surviving. I tell them about the swan rescue team and the way that they've improved the conditions and they look after them, and now they're absolutely flourishing. And people really appreciate seeing the swans on the river. And of course, fantastic views up and down the river as well. So that's really nice. People really appreciate that. And you'll be very pleased to hear that people, you might be surprised, say that the town looks very clean and tidy and that they think that we look after our town. So that's always good to hear. So obviously, tourism brings prosperity to the town. It has the feel of a prosperous place compared with somewhere like Evesham, which is about the same distance away from where I live. If you go to Evesham, it looks very sad, very run down, although it has a beautiful old buildings around where the old abbey was. It's a different feel entirely. So I think Stratford really does benefit from the tourism. And of course, what brings that tourism? Well, it is who, William Shakespeare. So you've got the theatre, of course, which is a huge employer and obviously attracts huge numbers of people in normal years. And the Shakespeare story and the fact that it's been a tourist hotspot really for people to do with Shakespeare for a very long time. But is it all about Shakespeare? I get so many different types of people who come. Some of them don't know much about Shakespeare at all. If they've come from maybe Japan or somewhere like that, they really don't know a great deal about him. A lot of people from around the world do know a lot about Shakespeare, particularly the Americans, even the Chinese, actually. They have a great regard for Shakespeare. But even some, British people. A lot of people are not that interested in Shakespeare, they think. Some of them have been put off, perhaps at school, by having been made to read Shakespeare in a rather boring way at school. But I find that by the end of the tour, even people who think they're not interested in Shakespeare usually discover that they are. Because if you talk about his life, the lost years, some of the theories about what he was doing, the questions people ask about how he ended up in London, did he travel abroad, did he even write the plays? Sometimes I do like to talk about the theories that the anti-Stratfordians have. It's a melting pot really of all sorts of different things. But going around the town, I try not to make it all about Shakespeare. There are lots of other things that you can talk about. So, for instance, our friend Mary Corelli, fantastic character, and provides great material for tour guides. Absolutely brilliant. And that leads really well into the story about Harvard House, of course, and the way that a lot of the buildings were preserved at a time when perhaps they were at risk of being demolished. This is a picture on the left, which I got from the internet, which shows the timetable of the special train which was laid on for the American ambassador to come up from London. And I don't know if you can read the timings, but he left London, according to this, at 5 minutes to 10, left Marylebone, and he arrived at Stratford at 12 o'clock. So that's about 2 hours. That's pretty good for a direct line to Stratford. Much better than today, I think. So that's a really good story, and it means that you can talk about different things. It's not all just Shakespeare. Also, of course, surrounding the canal, I like to talk about the history of the canal, how it was restored and reopened in 1964, and about the tramway. If I have time and if I have people that I think are interested, I might take them round to see the truck out on the rails outside the old the sawmill, the Cox's Yard building where the little cafe is now, and talk about the tramway and the history a little bit about that as well. So there's various things that you can bring in which are a bit different. So that's what people enjoy about the town. What don't they like, I wonder? Well, sometimes they like this, sometimes they don't. There's a bit of a difference of opinion. Some people get very cynical about what you might call Shakesploitation and all the marketing that goes on about it. Some people just think it's quite amusing. So I'm sure that you have perhaps all seen the bottles of beer, whiskey, gin now as well, and also wine, which have used various names to do with Shakespeare in their marketing. Perhaps you've been to the Shakespeare Cat Cafe. Did you know that there is a Shakespeare kebab? If you look on the bottom right there, you'll see there is a Shakespeare special. So kebab shop on Mere Street. The latest addition to the town is that Much a Shoe About Nothing shop. And then, of course, we have our living statues, the Ghost of Shakespeare, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So, you know, actually, it's a bit of fun, but it's nothing new. If you look back at the history of tourism, going right back really to the 18th century, there is a lot of what you might call Shakesploitation going on, going right back to Garrick's Jubilee, which I'm sure you know a lot about. I like this picture of the pavilion down by the river with all the cannon lined up there along the riverbank. So obviously this was a huge event in the sort of development of the tourism of history of Stratford. We always tend to say that David Garrick kick-started the tourist trade, but in fact there were tourists coming before that. Garrick himself came in the 1740s, and this picture shows you a few images of some of the souvenirs that were made of the famous mulberry wood. You'll all know the story of the Reverend Gastrell, the infamous Reverend Gastrell, who chopped down the mulberry tree in 1756 and sold the wood to Thomas Sharp, the local clockmaker, who made really a fortune, a racket, perhaps you might say, out of that mulberry wood. And I like to tell the story about there's so many different items that it couldn't possibly have all just come from one tree. So perhaps he was buying up wood from other places. And apparently the story goes that he would put one hand on his bench on top of some of the original mulberry wood, hold up another item in his other hand, and recite, "I do solemnly swear that I hold in my hand a portion of the tree Shakespeare himself planted." Try to persuade the punters. So again, going back to the 18th century, tourism was developing and has developed really ever since in a very similar way, actually. One of the famous people who was involved in the Garrick Jubilee was John Peyton, who was the landlord of the White Lion at the time. And he was very aware of the pluses that increased traffic and people coming to Stratford would bring, because he actually had the largest coaching inn at the time. He managed to get himself really effectively the catering contract for the Jubilee, so did very, very well. And he was very positive about promoting Stratford in years after that, taking people out on trips, even out to Bidford, actually, to show them the Falcon Inn, where Shakespeare was supposed to have drunk, and the famous crabapple tree, where he fell asleep on the way back to Stratford. But I love this little story of the Honourable John Byng, who some of you may have heard of. He was a great traveller, and he kept wonderful records and journals of his visits to places all around the country. He visited Stratford in 1785, and he says that he stayed at the White Lion Inn. He went into Shakespeare's birthplace to visit, when of course it was still an inn. It was the Swan and Maidenhead, and it was being run by descendants of Shakespeare's sister, Joan Hart, so the Hart family. And he says that he went inside and Mrs. Hart was trying to persuade him to buy souvenirs. He writes, "I bought a slice of the chair equal to the size of a tobacco stopper, and I eagerly eyed the lower crossbar of the chair, curiously wrought, which Mrs. Hart would not be tempted to part with." Later on, he went to Holy Trinity Church, visited the grave, and he says that he picked up a loose floor tile and slipped it into his pocket. Next day, after dinner, he was walking back outside the birthplace down Henley Street, and Mrs. Hart obviously beckoned him in. And he says in his writing, "Mrs. Hart took up my offer, and so I carried off with me the crossbar of Shakespeare's chair." So she was persuaded in the end to sell it to him. Perhaps he came up with the right price. But 7 years later, in 1792, he came back to Stratford and he visited the birthplace again. And he was horrified to discover that the whole chair had disappeared by then. They had sold every bit of it. And so he writes in his journal that he said to them, "Where is his old chair that you have now sold? Now I enter not. My words seem to shock them, and they have discovered that they have sold the goose that laid the golden eggs." Had they been masters of Italian policy, they had always kept an old chair ready to succeed the one sold, or the old one and sold the substitute. So I'm afraid he went away rather disillusioned, maybe in the way that some people do today. But it's just a lovely example of a story that you can tell in the story of how tourism developed. And of course, it went on to become a huge tourist attraction, particularly in the 19th century, when after the sale at the auction in 1847, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust was then created to run it as a museum. And it became, or had become really by then anyway, in the early 19th century, really a place of pilgrimage, and this sort of the writing about it is sometimes couched in quite religious terms, leading eventually to the coining of the phrase bardolatry by George Bernard Shaw a bit later on. So today, tourism is obviously a huge part of the economy of Stratford, as well as the theatre, but visitors coming to Stratford are really, really important. So as you can imagine, in the spring of 2020, when COVID hit, it was a huge shock. I mean, for us guides, you know, all our tours were cancelled. Our income just completely fell off a cliff, really, and a lot of us had to look around for other things to do. All sorts of things people ended up doing. I actually started doing online English teaching. I had a previous TEFL qualification, so I was able to do that. But yeah, very, very difficult time. And you might be familiar with perhaps walking through the empty streets. And when Stratford was really like a ghost town, it was quite extraordinary. Nobody in sight if you ventured into town. I tried to find out some information, some figures about how much the tourist economy is worth in Stratford, and some of you might have some better ideas. I did a bit of sort of Googling and searching around, but there seemed to be some very conflicting figures according to what sources you went to. But I thought I'd just give you a couple just for an indication. So for instance, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in 2020, they were expecting their income for the year to be about £10 million, but in fact they ended up less than 3 million in 2020. If you go to the Visit Britain website, they have some figures up for 2016, so a few years ago, obviously. But they reckon that the overseas visitors to Stratford in 2016 was 123,000 people, which I'm sure is it's much more. It would have been much more in, say, 2019, and rising all the time. You know, we have huge groups. I'm sure, be very familiar with the enormous groups quite often that you see of Chinese visitors. Used to be the Japanese, but now it's the Chinese. They come in very large groups. The Japanese still come, but in much smaller groups. And I do tours with the Japanese, but they use interpreters. So I would speak to the interpreter and they would then speak to the group. Whereas the Chinese, a lot of them, particularly the younger ones, are learning English in a huge way now, and they want tours in English so that they can practice their English skills. And that goes also for tours with a lot of student groups who come over from Europe. They want their tours in English so that you have to tailor it to whatever level they are. So if you have French or German or Spanish, you have to be able to sort of gauge their level and their interest to try to get it right for them. So I'm going to finish there.